Saint Devasahayam Pillai, April 23, 1712 to January 14, 1752. Devasahayam was born as Neelkandan Pillai into an affluent Nair caste family at Nadalam in present-day Kanyakumari district on April 23, 1712. His father, Vasudevan Nambudiri, was an Nambudiri Brahmin from Kayankulam in present-day Kerala state, and was a priest at the Adikasava Perumal temple in Thiruvattar, in present-day Kanyakumari district of neighboring Tamil Nadu. Neelkandan's mother, Devki Amma, hailed from Thiruvattar in Kanyakumari district and belonged to the Nair caste. Thus, Neelkandan's parents lived in their separate houses and met occasionally. As a youth of the Nair caste, Neelkandan was trained in the art of warfare, together with the study of the languages Tamil, Malayalam and Sanskrit. As a Nair by birth, he spoke Malayalam at home. But he was living in a region where Tamil was the spoken language of the majority. Besides the languages, Neelkandan was like all the Nair youth of his days, probably taught archery, Varmasastra, the South Indian martial art based on the science of human physique, and the use of weapons of war. It is possible that during his education, which was mostly private, in some way he came in contact with the Catholic faith. Neelkandan's family had much influence in the royal palace of Maharaja Marthanda Varma, king of Travancore, who belonged to the same Nair caste, and he went into the service of the royal palace as a young man. His capabilities and enthusiasm did not go unnoticed in the palace, as he was soon put in charge of state affairs as an official under Ramayan Dalawa, the Diwan of Travancore. He was an official in the court of the king of Travancore, Maharaja Marthanda Varma, when he came under the influence of Dutch naval commander, Captain Eustachius Delanoy, who instructed him in the Catholic faith. Conversion to Christianity. In 1741, Captain Eustachius Delanoy, a Dutch naval commander, was sent on command of a naval expedition by the Dutch East India Company with the objective of capturing and establishing a trading port at Kolachel, a port under the control of Travancore. In the ensuing Battle of Kolachel, fought between the Travancore forces and the Dutch forces, the Dutch were defeated. Delanoy's men were either killed or captured. Eustachius Delanoy and his assistant Donati surrendered and were imprisoned. Delanoy and the Dutchmen were later pardoned by the king, on condition that they serve in the Travancore army. In the course of time, Delanoy earned the trust of the king and went on to become the commander of the Travancore armed forces, the very forces that had earlier defeated him. He trained the Travancore forces on European lines, introduced new weaponry and gunpowder. As military commander, he won many battles for Travancore, resulting in the annexation of various neighboring territories to Travancore. It was during this time that Neelkandan came under the influence of Delanoy. The latter preached the Christian faith to Neelkandan, leading to his baptism in 1745. At this point, he took the name Devasahayam, help of God, which is the translation into Malayalam of the name Lazarus. Baptism. On Devasahayam's acceptance of the Christian faith, he was baptized at the Roman Catholic sub-parish church at Vadakankulam village, in the present-day Tirunelveli district of Tamil Nadu, where the Jesuits had a mission under Reverend Father Arbout Teriatalis S.J. Neelakanda Pillai, his name at birth, was then changed to Lazar, although he is more widely known by the Tamil and Malayalam translation Devasahayam, meaning God's help. Pillai was married by this time to Bhargavi Amal from Kunchavidu, Elanthavalai, Mai Code in Travancore state. She was baptized alongside her husband as a matter of course. She was given the baptismal name, Nanapu Amal, flower of knowledge, equivalent to Teresa in Tamil and Malayalam. Fearing reprisal in her native Travancore against her religious conversion, she chose to become a migrant resident of Vadakankulam village. Some other members of Devasahayam Pillai's immediate family also received baptism later. Orders based on accusations and charges. Church chroniclers say that the Brahmin chief priest of the kingdom, the feudal lords, members of the royal household and the Nair community brought false charges on Devasahayam to the Diwan, Ramay and Dalawa. The allegations were that he was indulging in orchestrating conversions to Christianity by using his powerful official position and the funds of an state as leverage and incentive to buy converts. He was also later accused of treason and of divulging state secrets to rivals and Europeans, because they were his co-religionists. Pillai was divested of his portfolio in the Travancore administration and was arrested. He remained in prison for 3 years, during which time the king of Travancore came under tremendous pressure from the Europeans seeking his release. Orders were finally passed for him to go into exile. He was initially ordered to be seated backward on a buffalo, a public humiliation, and paraded to the Kazumakad border, where he would be released and could enter into Dutch-controlled territory, or citadel/fortress used for trade and shipping. The original royal order was later altered, and Devasahayam was taken on the back of a buffalo to Arulvamuzhi border, much closer to the capital, Padmanabpuram, where he was tortured by 10 different Karyakars, royal officers, on the advice of the ministers, before being released into a mountainous forest area, on the other side of which was the kingdom of the Pandya kings, traditional rivals of Travancore. In prison at Arulvamuzhi. The last prison of the servant of God before his valiant death was at Arulvamuzhi, at the gate of the kingdom on the east confines. Devasahayam was brought to that place so that people might not know where he was. It is there that prisoners could be put to death in secret. The order from the king was that people should not be allowed to meet Devasahayam at all. But when the news of his presence in Arulvamuzhi spread, people from the surrounding Christian villages such as Pariyathazai, Kuthankuzhi, Manipad, Vadakankulam, the Valette, etc., streamed to him daily, so much, that the garrison looked more like a populous fair than a solitary place. The wife of the servant of God Devasahayam came to meet him there. He consoled his wife, who was all in tears, and encouraged her to trust in Jesus Christ. Then he advised her to go out of Travancore and live at Vadakankulam. She bade a tearful farewell. Third and final sentence to death and the plan to execute the servant of God secretly. Ramayan Dalava, the Prime Minister, and Singara Manavi, the Secretary, who had demanded the imprisonment and torture of Devasahayam Pillai, were disappointed and worried that Christianity might spread more if the servant of God was allowed to live any longer. Therefore they planned to have him killed. They approached the king and reported that his orders were not obeyed and Neelakundan was preaching his religion. The prison guard was immediately changed and a jailer unfriendly to Christians and to Devasahayam was appointed. The guards were also changed. The new officials obtained from the king an order to execute Devasayam Pillai secretly. Devasahayam's life during the years of torture. Bishop Clement reports that every morning and night Devasahayam spent some time for contemplation of heavenly things, often during the day. 2. He raised his mind to God and prayed briefly. He read aloud books of piety, especially the lives of saints, for the benefit of the bystanders. 2. In addition to the fast prescribed by the Church, the servant of God fasted on all Fridays and Saturdays in homage to the dying Christ and to the Mother of God. Devasahayam was open and obedient to priests, especially to his missionary, Father Buttery, whom he would contact through messengers and letters. He carried out his directions and counsels very promptly. Only thrice a priest could visit him at the dead of night. He made his confession and received communion. The priest was happy to meet a living martyr. Devasahayam was glad to confess his recurring sins with compunction and be finally refreshed and strengthened by the Most Holy Eucharist. Once a priest brought him communion secretly, during the day, and Devasahayam received it with great piety and devotion. He desired to receive these sacraments oftener, but it was not possible. Access to him was difficult for priests. The midnight execution. At the dead of midnight on January 14, 1752, as he lay in a restless state of prayer and sleep, Devasahayam was awakened by the soldiers and ordered to come out to another place. He is said to have remarked, "You need not pretend. I know whither you are taking me. Let us go." The venue they had chosen for the execution was on the fringe of the wild Arulvamuzhi forest. It was a deserted place, inaccessible to ordinary human beings. The spot was called Untitled, meaning the mountain with an unceasing flutter of winds. Here they had planned to set Devasahayam Pillai on a medium-size hillock and shoot him down from the ground. Musketeers and guns from the foundry were already kept ready for the operation. Those guns were most probably from the foundry at Udayagiri, produced by Delanoy. It was a sad irony that the weapon of Devasahayam Pillai's death was to be from the hands of the one who led him to the Christian faith. Everything and everybody was ready, but not so Devasahayam's legs. These could not move as he was chained to the fetters. The soldiers were in a hurry to carry out the operation in a hush. Their urging him to walk quickly was in vain. They then fashioned a strong stick, called Kathai in Tamil, and passed it in between his thighs and carried him like a hanging animal to Kadadai Malay. It was indeed a significant moment. A reputed palace official being carried away like an animal, or a sacrificial lamb, to be slaughtered for no crime other than accepting the lordship of Jesus Christ and living out a totally transformed social life. The thousands of the people whose lives he touched shed tears in their homes and hideouts. He too wept copiously, while praying constantly to the God for courage and determination. As they reached the venue of execution, he begged for time to pray. He was given the time and he prayed for a quarter of an hour, commending himself to God. The rock kneeling on which he said his last prayer still bears the marks of his elbows and knee. The shooting by soldiers and the death of the servant of God. Having finished his prayer, the servant of God told the guards that he had done what was his duty and they could carry out theirs. The guards made him stand on a medium-size hillock. The servant of God stood there ready to give his life for the faith in Christ. They took aim from another rocky place nearby and shot at him. 3 shots were fired at him, and the muskets failed to render him dead. He was still alive though deeply wounded. Buttery rounds off his narrative by saying that 2 more bullets were fired and they wounded him mortally, and he fell down crying aloud, "Jesus, save me." The guards checked to see if he had died, and seeing life in him still, they fired 2 more shots and the servant of God died, pronouncing the sweet names of Jesus and Mary. This death occurred in the 40th year of his life, having completed almost 7 years after his conversion to Catholic faith, having spent about 3 years in chains. During these 3 years there was no certainty of life or death. But the servant of God led a life of certitude and confidence in the help of God's grace, which was always available to him in prayer, penance, and the sacraments of the Church. Home for the bones. The dead body of Devasahayam rolled down to the ground. It is from this ground that pious Catholics have been taking out handful of earth as medicine for their ailments. Touching this blood-stained sacred ground stands a cluster of hillocks, which when the one near the sacred ground is a rock, when struck by an object produces in the pleasant sound of a bell, as it were to express its joy in having witnessed the death of a courageous Christian. In Tamil the hillock is called Mania Dikanpara, the rock with the sound of a bell. It is on this ground that there spreads out the branch of the banyan tree, which by its distinctness continues to pay its tribute to the memory of the martyr's dead body. The disposal of the body into jungle, the rediscovery of the same by the Christians, and the mortal remains buried in the church of Saint Francis Xavier, Qatar. The execution was carried out in absolute secrecy, and the Christians were not aware of what had happened. Not having found the servant of God in prison on the following days, the people came to know of his death. The missionaries approached the soldiers and obtained for a sum of money the fetters of the servant of God. But they could not approach the mortal remains because of the presence of soldiers. After 5 days they could discover the place, and they found only bones. It is probable that the body was burnt, and that is why there was no flesh on the bones. They gathered the bones and whatever was there of the mortal remains of the servant of God, and they were buried in a tomb in front of the main altar of the famous church of Saint Francis Xavier at Qatar, with due solemnity and honor due to a martyr. Thus Devasahayam Pillai, a lay person and a neophyte, was given a place which is usually given only to bishops and saints. It really indicates that the contemporaries of Devasahayam regarded him as a great saint and his death as the death of a martyr. The tortures and sufferings by Devasahayam. The tortures inflicted on Devasahayam Pillai by the persecutors can be divided into mental and physical. Mental tortures. Mental tortures are those which are aimed at causing mental fatigue, mental strain, and shame. When in the king's court the Dalava and Singara Manavi were deriding the Christians, calling them vile, dirty, and imbecile people, it was also an affront on the self-respect of Devasahayam Pillai, because he himself was a Christian. The servant of God was put to a lot of shame both in words and deeds. The manner in which he was seated on buffalo, garlanded with iruka flowers, and was given just a small piece of cloth to tie around his waist, was meant to bring shame on him before the large number of people who were accompanying the parade of shame. Secondly, because some Christians fled out of fear, or some denied their faith, even though only out of fear. Those who wanted to force Devasahayam Pillai to abjure his Christian faith laughed at Devasahayam Pillai on that account. One thing that hurt him most was that, during the tortures, his own wife abandoned faith for some time, though she repented and returned to faith soon. Thirdly, the journey on buffalo was a prolonged one, first for 16 days and then for several months. The ignominy of such a travel continued. Physical tortures. The kinds of physical tortures inflicted on the servant of God Devasahayam Pillai during the 3 years of his long wait to martyrdom. The narrowness of the prison. When he was arrested, Devasahayam Pillai was put in a narrow prison, as small as an oven, just 5 palms high, 1 cubit broad, and a little more than 1 cubit long. The prison's door was just 2 palms high. It would have been unimaginably hard to live in this cell, to which he returned after he was first taken for execution, then after the 16-day first parade on buffalo, and finally after the months-long parade throughout the kingdom. First condemnation to death and the revocation of the same. The next day the king pronounced a death sentence on the servant of God. The sentence made him happy that he had the grace of martyrdom. He was taken ceremonially to the place of execution. But the order was revoked by another order of the king, because some soothsayers had warned that great calamity would befall the kingdom if Devasahayam Pillai were to be put to death. The revoking of the sentence of death made the servant of God sad, because he was thus robbed of the glory of dying for Christ. He started to pray that he be more worthy of the gift of martyrdom. The soldiers were surprised to see that the servant of God went happily when he was told that he was going to be killed, but walked back sad when he was told that he had been spared. Parading on foot and use of chili and irritant herbs as instruments of torture. Adorned with a garland of ericu, caro tropes gigantea, accompanied by beating of drums, Devasahayam was paraded on foot through the capital in a shameful manner for 16 days. The use of chili, in the form of powder and paste, was used as an instrument of torture throughout the parade, first for 16 days and then for several months throughout the kingdom. This is what Buttery writes about it: this torture. Every day they rubbed his face and the rest of his body with copious poliguastro, pepper or some other pungent herbs, ground to powder, then with a certain thorny scourge resembling a file, they tore his back and opened it with many wounds, and then applied as medicine the above-mentioned pepper, powder, a horrible torture which is used in this land and causes a burning sensation like fire. Moreover, they threw pepper in the fire and forced the poor patient with his face downwards to inhale the horrible fumes rising thence. They put chili powder in his eyes when he lifted his eyes in prayer. Throughout the parading, he was accused and mocked at. But the servant of God himself raised his hands in prayer and praise. Parading on buffalo. Devasahayam was paraded on buffalo with hands tied behind and sitting backward. It was a shameful South Indian way of treatment meted out to persons to be punished. All along the way some people mocked at him and cursed him. Often he was beaten in public with tamarind stick and with thorny sticks in such a way as to tear open his flesh, and powdered chili was smeared over the wounds and all over the body. He was thus made to stand in the hot sun. The servant of God bore all these sufferings with patience and joy. Prolonged, unsafe and hard journey on buffalo. One can easily imagine how hard and unsafe it is to sit on the flat back of the buffalo. The servant of God could not hold on to anything, since his hands were tied behind. The roughness of the terrain and the roads would have often caused his fall. Besides, the buffalo, impatient of feeling a rider on its back, would shake him off and throw him to the ground. Second sentence to death and its revoke. The Christians were levied special taxes. Some Christians refused to pay them. Devasahayam was accused for it, that he had instigated their disobedience to king's orders. Therefore there was a second sentence to death. The servant of God was happy to hear about the sentence. But to his great disappointment, this sentence, too, was revoked.